First of all, you're watching that interview with the IS defector, with Stuart Ramsey. What did you make of what he had to say?
Well, I think, first of all, what I most took from that was it demonstrated the importance of getting people from within terrorist organizations who become disillusioned and who are then prepared to speak out and cooperate. Part of your program was saying how Cage and other apologists for Jihadi John was saying he was radicalized because the intelligence agencies approached him. Well, if they did approach him, it was partly, I suspect, to see, was he a convinced extremist, or might he be someone who had become disillusioned, because that does happen from time to time. And it's the single most important source of real intelligence you can get, someone who's been in the organization, who might indeed still be in a terrorist organization, but be prepared to cooperate.
But what about the counter to that, people do feel that they're spied on, it might alienate them? I mean, I know Cage have said that, but other people have said that
There's
as well.
an answer to that, which is a very obvious answer in a way. Why are the intelligence agencies taking an interest in them in the first place? They don't take an interest in people who don't already have a reputation for extremist opinions. Now, there is a difference between people with extremist opinions who don't commit acts of violence and those who do. But you can never tell that for certain in advance.
It's obviously a difficult question, but again, we had the parents of one of the girls who's gone there saying that she was terrified when she realised that the police were taking an interest in her.
Yes, but it does have to beg the question, why were they taking an interest in her? They don't do it at random. They don't go on fishing expeditions. At any given time, the intelligence agencies in the United Kingdom have about probably 3,000 to 4,000 names on their files of people who are known to have extremist opinions. Now, only a small proportion of them will go on to commit acts of terrorist violence, but you never know that at the beginning of the stage. And most of the radicalization that takes place nowadays isn't in the mosques, it's on the internet. It is people like, for example, Adebolawe and Adebolajo, who killed Lee Rigby. They were radicalized by contacts they had on the internet with people in the Middle East.
And are you convinced, as the Foreign Secretary is, and he said so in his speech, that if the Conservatives are returned to power, there really need to be much stronger intrusive powers for the authorities?
Well, I would hope whoever is returned to power would come to that conclusion. I mean, to be fair to the Labour Party, Labour governments were not soft on terrorism. They recognised, as do the Liberal Democrats, everyone does, but the incumbent government has a responsibility, whoever is that government. And they have to accept and realise that we are facing a threat that could happen at any time. I mean, there have been 2 serious terrorist threats in the United Kingdom each year that have been disrupted by our intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies. So this isn't hypothetical. It's already happening.
Mr. Hammond today praising the intelligence services for their hard work. I think few would doubt that they work hard, but actually, when you look at what's happened with IS, when you look at the way in which Russia has evolved over the last 2 years, we did miss it, didn't we?
Well, you don't always anticipate what's going to happen, because sometimes the people in the countries concerned don't anticipate what's going to happen. Think of the Arab Spring, for example, which began in Libya and in Tunisia and in Egypt. Even the Tunisians and Egyptians didn't expect it to happen.
But that begs the question, what's the value of intelligence?
No, well, I can answer that if I may. The primary value is to identify individuals who are a threat to our interests, either through terrorism or espionage or reasons of that kind. There is a wider role for the intelligence agencies, which is to collect information which might indicate what heads of governments that are unfriendly may be up to and may be planning. That's much more difficult. That's much more difficult. Sometimes our agencies do get it wrong. For example, on the Falklands, that was a huge error, a huge area of incompetence. The Bletchley Park, however, is when Britain broke the German naval code. That is the world's best intelligence achievement of all time.
And where do you think it went wrong with Russia? You were, of course, in the government for the early part of that. Where do we take the wrong turning in being too complacent or too trusting?
No, I think what people overlook is that what happened at the end of the Cold War wasn't one event. It was several events. It was the end of the Cold War, it was the end of communism versus capitalism, but most important in the current context, it was the end of Europe's last empire, the Russian Empire. And what Putin has never acknowledged or been prepared to accept, because Russian leaders believe that to protect Russia, they have to control what they call the near abroad, the countries around them. And that's not acceptable in the modern Europe. And this is the dilemma we face in Europe. Putin, with a lot of support in Russia, believes that they have a right to interfere with the independence of Ukraine or the Baltic
You say that now, but I mean, I remember going on visits to Russia with British Prime Ministers who saw him as a continuation after Yeltsin, after Gorbachev, leaders who wanted to be friendly with us. It's quite clear he doesn't, and we made a big mistake.
In the first period of Putin's rule, he brought back stability. Yeltsin's rule had been rather chaotic, rather anarchic. Putin represented stability. He was also fortunate. You've got to have a lot of luck at that level in politics, and he was lucky that the Russian economy, because of the oil price and matters of that kind, was taking off. So he was able to produce stability, and he was able to produce prosperity of a kind the Russians hadn't seen before. But ultimately, do never forget, he was beforehand a KGB policeman. And once a KGB
so
policeman...
So you don't think we basically were too complacent?
I don't think we were complacent, but I think there was some mistakes. I think all the talk about whether Ukraine should join NATO or not was ridiculous. I don't think there was ever a serious argument for that in the first place.
And do you think the fact that the outgoing government won't commit to the NATO spending target on defence somewhat undercuts all that Philip Hammond was saying about the
I'm very, very worried about that indeed, because, you know, it's not just a question of having the right armed forces, which are expensive. It is that your whole foreign policy will not have an impact. You will not have the influence required if you don't have a military capability as well. There's a marvellous quotation from Frederick the Great. The diplomacy without arms is like music without instruments. And that remains true. Not because you always want to use your arms, but you always have to have that option if the person you're negotiating with is aggressive and opportunistic.
So you would say that you would advise your Conservative MP, after all, you would advise the party to honour that spending pledge in the manifesto?
At the end of the day, the crucial question is not a precise percentage. It is whether you provide enough cash. I mean, what is absurd at the moment, I've got nothing against overseas aid, but the idea that we are committed, I'm going to be committed by law, to increasing overseas aid over the next couple of years, to ensure that it remains at 0.7, when we are actually going to be facing further cuts, is the height of irresponsibility. And
as far as oversight is concerned, the Intelligence Committee is very important. You've announced that you're stepping down. Are you still doing that job now?
I'm still on the committee. I was due to stop being chairman 4 weeks' time, because we end when the Parliament finishes. So I stepped down about 3 or 4 weeks before I was going to anyway. But I'm on the committee. We're publishing a very, very important report on privacy and security arising out of the Snowden controversies just in a couple of days' time. So I think that will be something well worth following.